A few months ago, I found myself in this really sterile boardroom in Washington, and I'm listening to this senior policy advisor. He's explaining the future of global democratic norms.
Right.
He was so passionate. He's waving around this 200-page report that took, I kid you not, 3 years and 40 subcommittees to finalize.
3 years!
To him, this document was a shield. It was a way to, manage the world's chaos through sheer legal consensus. He's talking about red lines and multilateral frameworks as if they were actual physical things, like they could stop a tank.
As if the words themselves had power.
Exactly. But then the whole mood in the room just shifted. A junior staffer leans in and shows him tablet. And it wasn't declaration of war. It wasn't some diplomatic incident.
What was it?
It was a time-lapse video. A video of a new logistics hub being built in the middle of Eurasia. And here's the kicker. In the time it took that committee to agree on the font for their report, an entire city-sized port had been carved out of the desert. 1,000 miles of standardized rail had been laid.
That's incredible. The contrast is just stark.
And the advisor's reaction was what really stuck with me. He didn't talk about strategy or the balance of power. He got weirdly, almost desperately, hung up on the paperwork.
The paperwork?
Yeah. He says his voice getting all high-pitched. They didn't file the environmental impact surveys. There was no 3-year public consultation period. This shouldn't be physically possible. He was genuinely offended that reality had the nerve to move faster than his veto process.
That look on his face must have been something. It's this moment of collision between the abstract world of rules and the material world of action.
It is the defining image of right now, of 2026. That mix of bureaucratic outrage and this cold, dawning realization of powerlessness. We have moved beyond the rules-based era into a period of, cold, hard physics.
Thermodynamic entropy.
Yes. The world has stopped listening to the people who write the memos. It's gravitating toward the people who pour the concrete. We're witnessing the end of a hegemony built on abstract values and the violent return of a world that's anchored in what you could call logistical sovereignty.
And that shock on the policy advisor's face, that perfectly captures the discontinuity we're all seeing. It's this collision between a process-based system and a results-based system.
That's our whole mission for this deep dive. We are going to analyze this massive transition. We're looking at the pivot from sea power to land power, comparing these high-capacity states with what are being called vetocracies, and, of course, the new financial systems that are backing it all up.
And what's really interesting here is how the very metrics of power are changing. It's not about values anymore. It's about deep time. It's about technical pragmatism and raw logistical efficiency.
Exactly. So let's start at the beginning, with the very foundation of all this geopolitical thinking, the struggle between land and sea.
It's the perfect place to start, because for centuries, literally centuries, global strategy has been defined by this tension. To get what's happening now, you have to go back to thinkers like Halford Mackinder.
Right, Mackinder's heartland theory. It's basically the intellectual blueprint for the British Empire's strategy, and then later the one the United States really perfected. It's all about geography as destiny.
It really is. Mackinder's view was simple, in a way. He saw the world as the world island, that's Eurasia and Africa, and then the surrounding islands. The absolute core of this was the heartland in central Eurasia.
And for maritime powers like the U.S., which is essentially a giant, protected, virtual island.
A virtual island, that's a good way to put it.
Their dominance depends entirely on making sure that huge Eurasian landmass stays divided. Fractured. Their security is all naval.
Because the ultimate nightmare for a sea power is a single cohesive alliance controlling the heartland. If that happens, they could mobilize the resources, the manpower, everything, and eventually challenge the sea power's control of the oceans.
So the strategy becomes...
What?
Constant management from the outside.
Constant management from the periphery. You control the sea lanes, the critical choke points, Suez, Malacca, you name it. You make sure your competitors can't easily trade without using those routes that you control. It's classic divide and rule on a global scale.
You can see the cold logic of it everywhere in history. After World War II, the U.S. didn't just dismantle Germany or Japan. It built these intricate webs of economic and military dependency.
The goal wasn't just peace. It was to make sure they stayed reliant on the U.S. security umbrella, on the U.S. financial system.
And this all got formalized after the Cold War. Yeah, I'm thinking of the Wolfowitz Doctrine.
Absolutely. The draft of the 1992 Defense Planning Guidance, which got leaked, it made the mission totally explicit. Sustain U.S. global primacy by actively preventing any new rival from emerging in Eurasia. The language was not subtle.
No, the objective was crystal clear. Prevent a new competitor from rising and maintain economic and security dependence among everyone else, and not just adversaries, but allies too.
Yes, that's a key point. It was designed to discourage major powers like Germany or Japan from even thinking about strategic autonomy, from trying to overturn the order that, well, benefited the hegemon.
And you had thinkers like Brzezinski who really hammered this home later. He basically said U.S. primacy depends entirely on how long it can maintain control over Eurasia.
He was cynical but pragmatic. I think he described the strategy as needing to, and I'm paraphrasing here, prevent collusion among the vassals, keep the tributaries pliant, and keep the barbarians from getting together.
The vassals. It's such a raw, systemic strategy of engineered fragmentation.
It is. But here's the great paradox we're seeing today.
Go on.
The decades-long effort to keep Eurasia divided, to foster these perpetual conflicts. It has ironically triggered the exact opposite result. It has accelerated deep integration between the major land powers.
It's the law of unintended consequences on a geopolitical scale. The pressure you apply just forces them to find a way around it.
Precisely. All the sanctions, the political interference, the economic coercion, it just creates this powerful incentive for the land powers to say, okay, we need to build our own systems, we need resilience.
If you're constantly under threat of being cut off from the dollar, you have no choice but to build an alternative that can't be vetoed.
And you see it most clearly with energy flows. It's a seismic shift. For decades, Russian gas fueled European industry America's allies. Now, it's being rerouted east. It's fueling the industrial growth of China and India.
That's not just a commercial transaction. That's the economic center of gravity of the entire planet physically moving eastward into the heartland itself.
So the response from China and Russia isn't just diplomatic statements. Their response is profoundly counter-hegemonic because it's material. They are building physical things, transport corridors, joint tech projects, parallel financial systems.
And that brings us right back to that key idea you mentioned at the top, logistical sovereignty. If the old power was based on the abstract ability to sanction someone, the new power is based on the material ability to build a bypass around the sanction.
That's the perfect way to put it. Logistical sovereignty is all about anchoring your trade in permanent physical infrastructure that someone else can't just turn off. Think about it. If your oil has to go through the Strait of Malacca,
it's vulnerable. A navy can blockade it.
It's totally vulnerable to the maritime hegemon. But if you spend billions building an overland rail line or a pipeline that crosses friendly territory for thousands of miles,
it's just inherently more resilient. You can't just park a carrier group in the middle of a continent and shut it down.
Right. The goal is security through development. The sheer physical reality of a standardized gauge rail line or a power grid or a fiber optic cable creates stability. It's a direct material challenge to the old strategy that depended on keeping everyone divided.
Okay, so this move towards material connection, towards building things, it's not happening in a vacuum. It has to be connected to a deeper ideological or political shift, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. To understand how these massive long-term projects are even possible, you have to look at the strategic framework that enables them. And that is the concept of the civilizational state.
The civilizational state, let's unpack that. It's a very different idea from the nation-state model we're used to in the West.
Very different. The European nation-state is a relatively recent invention, 19th century.
Yeah.
It's often defined by language or ethnicity or recent political borders.
Whereas a civilizational state claims something much grander. It's not just a nation. It's the representative of an entire unique civilization that goes back
thousands of years. It sees itself as having a philosophical and administrative continuity that transcends modern borders. And the key difference this creates is a focus on what you could call deep time.
Deep time.
Yes. If your state's legitimacy is measured in millennia, if you trace your identity back through ancient traditions, then a 4-year election cycle or a 10-year strategic plan just becomes, well, almost meaningless.
The priorities completely change. It becomes about generational endurance, the long-term survival of the civilization itself.
And that changes everything. It changes how you think about debt, about resource allocation, about infrastructure. Who cares about a short-term budget deficit if the dam you're building will benefit your society for the next 3 centuries?
It requires a kind of strategic patience that's frankly impossible in a lot of Western political systems.
And this deep time perspective leads to a worldview that is fundamentally anti-universalist. Meaning, the argument is that Western ideas like democracy or universal human rights aren't universal at all. They're just culturally specific Western values. From the civilizational perspective, each civilization needs its own political institutions that reflect its own unique history and culture.
Imposing one model on everyone else is seen as a form of cultural imperialism, I suppose.
Exactly. It's seen as inhibiting the revitalization of their own indigenous political traditions.
And China is obviously the most prominent example of this. It explicitly roots its identity in this continuous line going back thousands of years.
Right. Through various dynasties, through Confucian thought, through ancient administrative practices. And that continuity allows the state to operate under a very different social contract.
One that prioritizes the collective, the society, over the individual.
Correct. The emphasis is on duty, responsibility, and hierarchy, which stands in pretty sharp contrast to the Western focus on individual liberty and rights.
So in this model, where does the government's legitimacy come from, if not primarily from elections?
It comes from its functional role. Its legitimacy is derived from being the ultimate competent guardian of the civilization. Its job is to ensure that civilization survives and thrives.
So the current governance structure is seen internally as just the most efficient vehicle for that very, very long-term project.
It provides this deep historical justification for centralized power that is intensely focused on competency, stability, and just raw administrative capacity.
This long-term focus, it seems to crystallize into a kind of strategic doctrine. Let's call it Asian realism. It's all about developmental needs over ideological arguments.
A perfect example is the whole situation with the transboundary rivers between China and India. For years, the Western analysis was obsessed with the idea of inevitable water wars.
Right, the zero-sum thinking. The narrative was that China, being upstream on rivers like the Brahmaputra, would just choke off India's water supply to gain leverage.
That narrative assumed that rivalry had to trump everything else. But the reality turned out to be far more pragmatic.
Because while the border tensions are very real, the developmental needs of billions of people, water security, industrialization, domestic stability, those are just much bigger, more pragmatic priorities.
When your goal is securing economic growth for the next 50 years, ideology takes a backseat to resource security and technical cooperation. So they created a Sino-Indian agreement on managing these rivers.
They just bypassed the ideological conflict and focused on the technical execution.
And this is where that idea of technical pragmatism becomes the ultimate measure of competence. The national interest gets defined by delivered competence.
A single functional protocol for sharing hydrological data is worth more than 10,000 speeches on universal values.
Infinitely more valuable. And that protocol isn't a small thing. It means standardizing measurements, agreeing on real-time data sharing, building the infrastructure to manage the downstream impact of dams. It requires incredible technical mastery.
And that kind of cooperation is just a powerful rejection of the old containment model. These regional actors are deciding for themselves what's important, and is almost always internal stability and shared development.
They're setting their own strategic temperature, you could say.
The strategic discipline and this 30-year planning horizon we're talking about, it really throws the structural flaws of Western systems into sharp relief. Which brings us to the flip side of the coin, political decay and the problem of vetocracy.
The term comes from political scientists like Francis Fukuyama. Political decay is what happens when a system's institutions become too rigid. They just fail to adapt.
Why does that happen?
Usually it's the self-interest of political insiders or deep institutional inertia. It's just easier to keep doing things the old way, even when it's obvious they aren't working anymore.
And vetocracy is the symptom of that decay.
It's the most visible symptom. It's a system where authority is so fragmented, the checks and balances are so excessive that you get chronic political paralysis. The ability to obstruct, to veto things, is just vastly greater than the capacity to build or to govern.
You see it in the declining quality of the bureaucracy, a state that just gets less and less efficient over time.
The U.S. system, in some ways, is an almost perfect model of this. The checks and balances, the Senate filibuster, the incredible reliance on judicial review, it all creates this structural paralysis.
The process is so judicialized. Critical policy isn't made by expert administrators or through legislation. It's constantly being fought out in the courts.
Right. Congress basically invites private parties to sue administrative agencies, which results in this dizzying complexity for any major project. The transaction costs are astronomical.
Just think about trying to build a new highway or a pipeline or, God forbid, a nuclear plant. You're facing years, maybe decades of litigation and environmental reviews that are often just used as delaying tactics.
The cost of just complying with the process before you even break ground can kill a project.
And the data on this is really stark, isn't it? The legislative success rates in the U.S. have just plummeted.
They've fallen off a cliff. From around 7% down to 2% in the modern era. That's not just politics. That reflects a systemic inability to govern effectively.
Which then feeds into this really dangerous, vicious cycle.
It does. When the state performs poorly, when it can't deliver basic infrastructure or services, the public, understandably, loses trust in it.
And then political actors use that distrust to argue for less government capacity. They slash budgets, they get rid of experts.
Which just reinforces the cycle of decay. It guarantees the state will underperform even more in the future. It's a death spiral of competence.
And that's the cultural chasm right there.
Yeah.
Goes back to the anecdote from the beginning. In the West, you have people trying to navigate this nightmare of lawsuits and reviews that a single election can just wipe out.
Versus the approach in many Asian capitals, where the focus is on a technocratic government that can execute a 30-year master plan that survives the whims of day-to-day politics. The state is seen as a permanent legacy to be built, not a temporary prize to be won.
So to really understand the alternative to this political decay, we need to look at a state that has basically engineered superior administrative capacity from the ground up. Let's talk about Singapore.
It's the perfect case study because it occupies this very unique institutional space. It's consistently ranked as an incredibly free market economy.
And yet it operates as a highly centralized technocratic state with just immense influence over its economy.
The contradiction is only on the surface. It's rooted in these rigid Western definitions of what capitalism is supposed to be. Singapore keeps its headline taxes low and its bureaucracy lean, which looks great on international metrics.
But the state's actual influence is enormous. It's just channeled through these very strategic, non-traditional mechanisms.
And the system maintains its legitimacy for one simple reason. It delivers. Consistently. It produces material well-being, trade surpluses, economic growth. And the engine of that success is not a big bureaucracy, but this hyper-efficient, centralized planning body that can execute long-term industrial policy with incredible precision.
And you've argued that this efficiency comes from the state's control over three key markets: land, capital, and labor.
Near total control, really. Mastering these three nodes gives the government a power to direct the economy that goes far beyond what normal taxes or regulation could ever achieve.
Let's start with land. That seems foundational.
It is. Land is the ultimate fixed factor of production. State ownership in Singapore went from about 25% in the mid-1960s to over 90% today.
How do they manage that?
Through the Land Acquisition Act of 1966. It was a revolutionary piece of legislation that basically codified the principle that private property rights were secondary to state-led development goals.
So the state could just acquire any land it needed for public works at a low price?
Essentially, yes. And that level of control over physical space is extraordinary. It lets the government perfectly align decades of physical engineering housing, ports, rail lines with its long-term economic plans. It completely bypasses the vitocratic gridlock over land use that paralyzes so many other countries.
Okay, so that's land. What about capital?
Singapore directs huge amounts of capital using these very sophisticated extra budgetary tools. The key one is the Central Provident Fund, the CPF. It's a mandatory social security and forced savings scheme.
How does it work, in simple terms?
Both employers and employees have to contribute a big chunk of their salary, up to 37% into individual CPF accounts.
And that centralized pot of money is then used for what?
For more than just retirement, it funds massive national infrastructure projects. It allows the state to maintain huge foreign reserves. It's an incredibly powerful tool for mobilizing capital without running up massive public debt.
And then you have the government-linked entities, or GLEs. This is where the line between public and private gets really blurry.
Completely blurry. These are companies held under private entities like Temasek Holdings, but they operate under deep state influence and strategic direction. And the scale is just staggering.
How staggering?
GLEs make up over 40% of the entire stock market capitalization. So nearly half the domestic economy, ports, telecoms, defense, you name it, is ultimately lapped back to the state's long-term strategic vision.
Which allows for incredible coordination. I saw a statistic the GLEs coordinated something like 2/3 of the key assets in the real estate investment trust sector.
Yes. That kind of presence ensures that crucial urban and infrastructure development happens in a coordinated way, preventing market chaos or misallocation of capital.
And finally, labor.
The state secures a disciplined workforce and its own top talent through an institutionalized meritocracy. The best and brightest students are channeled into government and the GLEs through scholarships. It's a self-sustaining system for maintaining state capacity.
And the workforce itself is institutionally disciplined.
Right.
No disruptive strikes.
Right. Wages are set in line with national competitiveness by a tripartite council of government, unions, and employers. It ensures labor stability and predictable costs, which is a huge draw for foreign investment.
So the Singapore model really shows that state capitalism, when done this way, isn't an ideological failure. It's a distinct and highly efficient institutional model that can generate sustained growth.
As long as the internal logic, longevity, stability, technical competence is prioritized over external ideals, this is the structural capacity that powers logistical sovereignty at a national level.
Okay, so this superior state capacity, this ability to actually execute on 30-year plans, has to be applied somewhere. This brings us back to the main engine of Eurasian integration we've been seeing, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
The Silk Road Economic Belt is China's massive, multi-trillion-dollar vision to fill that critical infrastructure vacuum across Eurasia. The motivation is complex. It's about internal economic security, increasing financial clout, securing raw materials,
and also mitigating security threats through development. I think President Xi defined development as the greatest form of security.
That philosophy is at the core of it. If you build stable economies and logistics networks, you reduce the incentives for conflict. The entire initiative is designed to be anti-hegemonic, prioritizing economic cooperation over political alignment.
It's an explicit pushback against the old regional security framework, proposing instead that Asian security should be managed by Asians, built on a foundation of shared development.
And the most concrete, most advanced example of this strategy in action is probably the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC.
It's considered the flagship project, right?
Yeah.
Mostly because of the deep political trust between the two countries, which allows for really streamlined implementation.
That's a huge part of it. But fundamentally, CPEC is driven by China's strategic need to diversify its trade routes away from vulnerable maritime choke points.
The Malacca Strait.
Exactly. The vast majority of China's trade and energy imports have to pass through that narrow strait, which could easily be blocked in a conflict.
So CPEC gives them secure land access to the Indian Ocean through the Gwadar port in Pakistan. It shortens supply lines and acts as a crucial insurance policy against the weaponization of the Malacca Strait.
The scale of the investment shows how important this is. The initial package was around $46 billion, and a huge chunk of that, about 76% of the early investment, went directly into fixing Pakistan's crippling energy and infrastructure crisis.
So things like massive new power plants.
Exactly. The Sahiwal and Port Qasim coal plants, for example. The goal is multifaceted: boost Pakistan's economy, connect it to China's, and, crucially, generate sustainable employment to help erode the social discontent that can breed security risks.
And it's more than just ports and power plants. It's upgrading the Karakoram Highway, laying fiber optic cables, modernizing Pakistan's entire railway network. It's logistical sovereignty being built mile by mile.
And this push for connectivity doesn't stop there. It extends deep into the heartland, which requires cooperation with Russia.
Russia's decision to link its Eurasian Economic Union, the EEU, with the Belt and Road was a major step, a very pragmatic turn to the east.
It was a decision that was definitely accelerated by external pressures. The sanctions after the Ukraine crisis really forced Russia to decrease its dependence on European markets and integrate more with Asia.
And the EEU, on its own, has limitations. It's regional, a bit protective, and it doesn't have the kind of investment capital needed for major modernization.
This is where the BRI becomes the perfect supplement. It provides the investment capital the EE lacks. It improves industrial competitiveness across the region and helps bring economic stability to Central Asian countries.
So the dynamic in Central Asia becomes this highly effective division of labor, as it's been described.
It's a great way to put it. It avoids direct competition. China brings its comparative advantage, which is massive financial capital, and the ability to build huge infrastructure projects.
While Russia maintains its deep historical, political, and military ties in the region, often acting as the primary security provider.
It's a pragmatic alignment that ensures stability in the heartland while letting both powers play to their strengths, all moving toward the common goal of continental integration.
It's a powerful example of overriding historical suspicions for concrete, long-term developmental goals. Logistics and stability just matter more than abstract political competition.
And this rise of Eurasian material power, this ability to build things free of external vetoes, is tied directly to a structural shift in the financial world. It's all part of a global search for strategic autonomy in a post-dollar world.
The existing international monetary system built around the U.S. dollar and the correspondent banking system gives the U.S. an immense amount of power.
Coercive power, often. To understand why, you have to get how the correspondent banking system works. If a foreign bank wants to make a transaction in U.S. dollars, it has to have a relationship with a U.S. bank.
Meaning that basically every major cross-border dollar transaction, even between two non-U.S. entities, has to touch the U.S. financial system at some point.
It's a critical choke point.
Yeah.
And it allows the dollar to be weaponized through sanctions. If you cut a country's banks off from the U.S. system, you've effectively isolated them from the global economy.
Even for things like importing medicine, which are supposed to be exempt, the banks just won't take the risks.
The risk aversion is huge. So this coercive power is what's driving emerging powers to find alternatives. The main goal is just risk mitigation. They need to reduce their vulnerability to a financial system that can be used as a weapon by a distant political power.
And this is manifesting as balancing diplomacy among emerging middle powers, right? Countries like Turkey, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia.
Exactly. This group is really driving global multipolarization. Historically, middle powers might have had capabilities, but they usually just deferred to the major hegemons. That's changing completely.
They're refusing to pick a side.
They're adopting a strictly non-aligned, non-interference approach. They want to maintain good, mutually beneficial relations with everyone, the US, China, Russia, the EU. The goal is to maximize their own national interest and preserve their strategic autonomy.
It's a way to avoid getting tangled up in great power conflicts. It's a very pragmatic cost-benefit analysis.
It gives them huge advantages. They can maintain valuable trade with the West while also participating in major initiatives like the BRICS and BRICS. And it serves a defensive function, too.
How so?
When you have crucial relationships with multiple major powers, it becomes structurally very difficult for any single one of them to exert overwhelming pressure on your domestic policies.
You see this in practice all the time. Saudi Arabia works closely with the U.S. military, but it maintains an independent oil policy through OPEC+ and works with China on infrastructure.
Or India, which is the classic example of strategic balancing. They buy S-400 missile systems from Russia while also enhancing tech and economic collaboration with the U.S.
It's about maintaining options. When those border tensions flared up with China, India was very explicit that it would not seek mediation from any third party. It was a signal of strategic independence.
These emerging middle powers understand their geopolitical capital is significant. Their location, their resources, their massive markets. They're no longer content to be followers. They're moving to the center of the world system.
And this shift in power, combined with the risk of dollar weaponization, is eroding confidence in the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. This is opening the door for a new financial architecture.
And one of the biggest vectors for this de-dollarization, especially in the global south, is the development of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs.
It's interesting that this innovation is really being driven by the global south.
It's driven by necessity. They need to fix dysfunctional monetary systems and reduce their reliance on the US-dominated hierarchy. CBDCs offer a way to facilitate direct bilateral payments that can bypass the SWIFT system and the correspondent banking structure.
It's an infrastructure solution to a geopolitical problem.
It is. And that same necessity is driving multilateral platforms like BRICS. It's seen by these middle powers as a way to reformulate the global economic order, to redefine the rules of the game.
And BRICS is more than just a talking shop. It has things like the New Development Bank, which offers a real financial alternative to the IMF and the World Bank.
Which enhances their foreign policy options and bolsters their diplomatic independence. The appeal is undeniable. You have over 30 countries that have now expressed interest in joining the BRICS framework.
They're all seeking diversified cooperation, ways to enhance the resilience of their own supply chains and mitigate the risks from all this geopolitical fluctuation.
This quest for new financial infrastructure, for systems that resist sanctions and coercion, is the ultimate expression of logistical sovereignty in the monetary domain. It completes that transition from abstract rules to concrete, self-sustained material capacity.
So what really emerges from this deep dive is a picture of a new global synergy. It's the rise of these civilization states that are prioritizing enduring national interests, structural longevity, and, well, material competence over any kind of ideological purity.
The strategic discipline you see in the Singaporean model, the multi-generational planning of the civilizational state, the sheer scale of the BRI, these models just offer a distinct and powerful advantage in tackling the kind of complex long-term challenges that structurally cripple vetocracies.
The old Western script of, democratic encirclement and ideological rivalry, it feels like it's been completely bypassed. It's been bypassed by actors who are just focused on building something concrete and permanent.
And the failure to comprehend this non-confrontational, logistics-driven order leaves those old ideological narratives just struggling to explain what's happening.
The global political center of gravity has definitively shifted. It's proving that the ultimate measure of national power now is logistical sovereignty.
The ability to bypass the veto, to pour the concrete, to lay the standardized gauge rail, and to execute generational plans without the crippling obstruction of political decay. When the capacity to write a memo is overwhelmed by the capacity to build a port, the world changes.